everybody to this evening's Manchester Classical Association public lecture, jointly hosted with the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies here at Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm April Pudsey. I'm Deputy Director of the Centre for Youth Studies and Chair of the Manchester branch of the Classical Association. And this evening, it's a huge honour to welcome our speaker, Dr Kelsey Shawn Madden, who is an early career fellow at the School of Advanced Studies at University of London, and recently obtained her fantastic PhD from University of Sheffield under the supervision of Professor Maureen Carroll, working on exploitation of women and vulnerable women and trafficking of women in the Roman Empire. And she's published around these topics and is working on childhood vulnerability, particularly around warfare and the propaganda around that in the Roman world, and has various projects relating to that on the go. So I'm sure we'll hear more about those. And Kelsey is going to talk to us this evening about the exploitation and trafficking of children in the Roman Empire. So I will, without further ado, hand straight over to you, Dr. Madden.
Thank you so much, April. Let's see. Did this right earlier. Here we go. Can you see it?
Yes, that's visible. Yeah.
Okay, good. Great. Thank you so much again, April, for having me tonight. I'm very excited, and it's an honor to come and speak for the Manchester Classical Association and the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies. And as you said, I will be talking about the exploitation and child trafficking in the Roman world. So I guess this would be a good point to point out kind of a content warning. We'll be talking about sexual assault and abuse of children. So if you find this, we all find this topic quite disturbing, but if you find it particularly disturbing, I will not be offended if you need to pop out at any time. So this presentation delves into the intricate connection between wartime sexual violence and the trafficking of children by Rome from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD. I'm not going to go over a chronological list of materials per se in order, and this presentation is kind of an amalgamation of ideas that I have surrounding this topic. So any input and feedback at the end would be muchly appreciated. So I investigate this topic from both literary and visual material source evidence, particularly Roman conquest iconography, and we'll see a bit of other small figurines and things like that throughout. And this reveals how these depictions of children are shaped by social and institutional constructs that reflect Roman power, identity, social hierarchy, and sexuality. By analyzing these factors within the context of imperialism, including large-scale territorial expansionism and patriarchal wartime violence, we gain insight into how these visual representations serve to depict the trafficking and vulnerability of non-Roman children. Specifically, they embody the experience of enslavement. And this interdisciplinary approach draws from art history, archaeology, and gender and sociology studies. So the exploration of this topic may evoke some grave concern and shock. Children are the most vulnerable groups, particularly at risk during times of war and conflict, with currently 426 million children globally living in conflict zones, with 72 million living near armed groups perpetuating sexual violence against them. Exploited for various purposes, including as child soldiers and cheap labor, children have historically been subject to sexual exploitation, a phenomenon that persists today, and mirroring practices during the Roman period. So Roman and non-Roman children held different value in the eyes of Rome, with non-Roman children serving as potent symbols in conquest iconography, representing the vulnerability and subjugation of the defeated barbarian tribes. They also acted as agents of acculturation, symbolizing this assimilation into Roman culture under the guise of protection. Furthermore, these children were treated as commodities and war spoils, as we will see, showcased in triumphal displays. By examining the capture and transport of captives through the lens of trafficking, we unravel the logistics depicted in conquest iconography. Through the examination of pictorial and literary evidence from the perspective of trafficking, I aim to illuminate and shed light on the lived realities of these children during their capture and transportation, and thus shedding more light onto the trafficking practices of Rome. So there's an extensive and deep exploration of sexual exploitation and captive children in Rome that remains relatively scarce until recently, with a wonderful edited volume that's going to come out edited by Ulrika Ruff. And before that, Janine Uzi was a big proponent of this idea. So while scholars have extensively examined the literary and visual exploitation of enslaved children in general, there has been a reluctance to acknowledge the eroticization of captive and enslaved children in Roman visual material. This reluctance can be attributed to the prioritization of the Roman victor's perspective and the perpetuation of classical tradition. Unlike modern societies where children and sex are not equated, the portrayal of captive children in conquest iconography and other art forms reveals Rome's predatory and exploitative political economy. Just going on its own. Okay, to provide a quick general overview of what is articulated as childhood in this context. So childhood is in any society is shaped by a complex interplay of biological, social, practical, and legal factors unique to that society's cultural and temporal context. So Roman children experienced childhood through various rites of passage, symbolized and adorned by their clothing and art. However, captured and enslaved children, viewed as property, were deprived of these rights and experiences. Furthermore, there is a noticeable gender bias in the pictorial evidence, with depictions largely framed from the perspective of adult male captors, reflecting the dominance of the male or masculine gaze in Roman visual culture. And before we get to this definition of trafficking, I wanted to provide a brief background on children in Roman slave society to kind of set this all into the correct context. So the institution of slavery, intertwined with Roman concepts of virility and sexuality, emerges as a key factor contributing to the vulnerability experienced by enslaved children. In the context of Roman slavery, it can be argued that sexual encounters between master and enslaved do not constitute what modernity would term, quote, child abuse. Child sexual abuse is also a modern concept. The ancient Romans held markedly different perspectives on sexual abuse compared to our modern sensibilities, with sexual behaviors being understood as culturally defined terms. In Roman society, it was socially, ethically, and legally permissible to engage in sexual acts with enslaved individuals, including children, as documented by sources such as Plutarch's Moralia. Additionally, Roman law did not protect enslaved children from sexual encounters. So this brings me to why is it important to use a more modern term of definition of trafficking when discussing particularly the capture and transport of captives versus the use of the term trade. So the difference between traffic and trade is the different steps and manners in which people are moved. So trade means buying and selling goods or services. Trade is more appropriately used in the context of slavery and post-capture. People captured by Rome were purchased and sold in the slave trade. The term traffic is used to explain the moment of capture and transportation. To traffic someone is to take and move them by force. After captives were trafficked, they were placed into the slave trade. In some instances, trade and traffic can then overlap. The nationally agreed upon definition of trafficking is what can aid us in identifying the same method used in the ancient past. So here you have the United Nations defining traffic in human beings. The critical aspect of this definition are transport, transfer by means of threat or use of force, the abuse of position of vulnerability, and the giving or receiving of payments for the purpose of exploitation. The quote-unquote barbarian children taken by Rome were not recruited, but physically forced to submit before, during, or after battle. Some children were then displayed in the triumph of the victorious general, while others were sent to the slave market. During the capture and transportation of these children, they were more certainly threatened, used by force, coerced, deceived, and exploited sexually. In the Roman world, military commanders, soldiers, slave dealers and even people who followed the Roman army to help move goods and people, and the emperor all had the power and ability to traffic children. These people could also act as middlemen in moving children from the moment of their capture to their purchase. Epigraphic evidence for captive children is scarce, but we do have an example from a funerary inscription that identifies a young captive woman. At the fall of Jaffa during the First Jewish War in AD 66, according to Josephus, once all the fighting aged men were killed, quote, There were no males now remaining besides infants, which, with the women, were carried as slaves into captivity, end quote. Over 2,000 women and children were reported taken captive during this conflict. So we have a funerary inscription that possibly attests to the capture of one of these women, and this is the funerary epitaph of Claudia Astor. And it reads, Claudia Astor, prisoner from Jerusalem. Tiberius Claudius Proculus, imperial freedman, took care of the epitaph. I ask you, make sure through the law that you take care that no one casts down my inscription. She lived 25 years. So Claudia bared a two-part Roman name, which is typical for Roman female citizens, but she was likely taken as a war captive, enslaved, and later then freed by Tiberius Claudius Proculus. Upon her manumission, she would have adopted the feminine name of her benefactor's name, resulting in her two-part Latin name at the time of death. As pointed out by Maureen Carroll, who is in the audience, the epitaph does not provide her age at capture or sale, and the inscription cannot be dated accurately, so it is unclear if she was enslaved as an infant or an adolescent. It has been suggested by others that she was probably captured just or before the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. She was then transported to Pudsey, which is where this epitaph was found in Italy, the second largest is also where the second largest slave market in Italy resides. So transportation is a key aspect of the trafficking process, obviously. Transportation ensures the total separation of the children from everything they know. Should the children successfully escape, it prevents them from being able to find their way back home. Most of these children would never have traveled as far as the Roman army would take them. Many children would be separated from their families to then be sold separately. As isolation increased, they would not know how to find their way home. The Romans took them from their geographical and cultural home. The children could then be stuck. Suetonius notes that Augustus understood this separation from their homeland as an essential aspect of trafficking. He says, quote, on those who often rebelled or under circumstances of especial treachery, he never inflicted any severer punishment than that of the selling the prisoners, with the condition that they should not pass their term of slavery in a country near their own. So to go to conflict iconography, there are 3 steps that I have identified as a form of trafficking, and these start with capture, transport, and then they are shown in scenes of triumphal processions or displayed as trophies, and I'll explain what that is in just a minute. So non-Roman children are under the threat of violence in this imagery. In Trajan's column, scene 90, a child grasps his father's tunic in fear as he is seemingly about to be trampled by Trajan's horse. Another scene on the Antonine Vatican Clemency sarcophagus depicts a male child offered up to a Roman soldier by a captive woman. The soldier stands behind the child with his right arm extended to accept the offering, and his left hand grasps his sword, signaling an element of threat between the Roman and captured barbarians. These scenes of fearful children and Roman soldiers on alert, quote, confirm the power structure to which non-Romans are subject and the threat of violence behind that power structure, end quote. So the threat of violence is what underpins these images and reflects how using this type of violence ensures total capture and submission of the enemy. On the column of Marcus Aurelius seen here, some children grasp onto their mothers in fear of the Roman soldiers who are forcefully pushing the pair into a transport group. Others are forcefully pulled away from their mothers. The children are not depicted with gestures of wartime sexual violence or assault, but they are paired with their mothers who do. They have their hair being pulled, their hair is down loose, indicating fleeing movement. We have a Roman soldier on the right here pulling her hair, a tunic pulled down revealing a bare breast are all signifiers of wartime sexual assault and abuse. Sexual violence and unspoken truth behind these images is also a lived threat towards these children, being directly associated with their mothers who have been. As discussed above, the lived experience of captured and trafficked children would have been consumed by this sexual exploitation and abuse. We then have transport scenes. So we have Trajan here with a group of noble Dacian women offering up their toddlers their young children, both male and female, can be identified here by their hair types. So the little girls have a little bun on their hair, and the boys do not. And you can see the transport ship in the background. And then on the right-hand side, we have a young girl on the back of a cart. Looks like it's being drawn by a draft animal. Again, this is on the column Marcus Aurelius, scene 100, with her mother. Then we get to triumphal processions. So here on the triumphal frieze of Trajan's Arch at Benevento from the 2nd century, we have a Gallic family being displayed processing through a triumphal procession in Rome. And you have 2 different ages of children here, an infant and a boy who would seem to be more, I would call all older than a toddler. We also have trophy scenes. So on the 2nd century battle sarcophagi, we have captives who are stood at the base of a tropaeum, which is a wooden stake that holds the arms of the captives, the defeated captives, and then a male and female pair. And in this instance, you have 2 different children, one an infant suckling at its mother's breast, and then a small, what looks like a little boy holding on to his mother's garb on the right-hand side. So there's this idea of wartime sexual violence and abuse being intrinsically linked with trafficking. And in a modern comparison, Catherine Farr examined 23 modern countries torn by civil war and found that during armed conflicts, rape and sexual enslavement increase women and young girls' risks of being trafficked. This increased risk is linked to demand. She found that the trafficking of women and young girls for sex and enslaved labor extends beyond wartime, making wartime abuse a general form of violence against women and continued exploitation. What is missing from Farr's examination is the threat of sexual violence to boys. This is no doubt a result of Western cultural biases and phobias of homosexuality, as this study was conducted in the early 2000s. And as we will later see, the sexual abuse of captive boys during wartime was a common practice in the Roman period. And the Romans had a concept of hostage and a captive also being intrinsically linked with wartime sexual violence. Cicero stated that rape is a custom of war, and Virgil equated the enslavement of captives with rape. At the same time, Dionysius of Halicarnassus labels rape as essential for a captive. Therefore, wartime rape committed by the Romans can be classified as a pathological character to uphold the custom of war and an essential act expected to befall a captive child taken. Moreover, hostages have 2 functions that are defined by social status. 1, noble barbarian children taken as political hostages to ensure a lasting peace between the enemy and Rome, and then noble and non-noble barbarian children taken hostage to be tortured and assaulted in front of their families to create fear and force compliance and submission of the enemy. The Roman authors report that Romans were actually deeply feared and were concerned for the sexual violation of their women and children during times of conflict, which eliminates the ubiquity of this act. This was likely more related to the fear that once a young female Roman citizen was assaulted, her marriage prospects would be limited, which would then threaten the growth of the Roman family and citizenry at large. We have an example from the Second Punic War in 215 BC that has noble Iberian women and their daughters treated horribly by Hannibal's soldiers, who were given to the Roman general Publius Scipio. Annibal, the leader of the Iberian army, sided with Carthage but wanted to be on the side of Rome, so he pleaded to Scipio for his protection. So here he talks about understanding what it means to be of youth and beauty of young daughters of Annibal and their princesses. And this woman pleads to Scipio to take them in, and she basically tells to him that you don't understand what's going on here. We could be sexually assaulted at any moment. And Scipio acts like he has no idea that this could happen, and then she brings this. She makes him aware of the situation, and of course he brings her into his fold with good cheer and says that he will protect her and all of the other daughters. Obviously, this was more of the idea of Roman clemency than anything else. But Polybius notes a distinction between hostages and captives based on treatment. He states that they had found the Iberian women and daughters not treated like hostages, but like captives and enslaved people. Whoops, sorry. This evidence suggests that the Iberian women and daughters were sexually assaulted, which is what licentious treatment here must mean. The separation of terms suggests that the Roman standard treatment of noble hostages was typically higher in most circumstances than that of captives and enslaved people. In other words, there was a general understanding among the Romans that noble hostages should not be sexually assaulted. Scipio implies that the safety of the women and daughters was not guaranteed under the protection of the Iberian fathers. In this instance, this notion may allude to the practice of Iberian fathers arranging marriages for their daughters or passively allowing them to be subjected to sexual violence. Scipio clarifies that if daughters of the defeated Iberians to be released, the conquered first had to salute Scipio and Rome as their new rulers. The daughters were handed over on the condition that the Iberians now follow and obey the Roman commanders. Scipio assures Annibales that the Iberian daughters were unharmed by Roman soldiers and would not be harmed by the Romans as long as the Iberians followed the treaty. The Iberian daughters are being transformed from the state of captives to noble hostages by Scipio based on this treatment. By submitting to and accepting Roman rule, the Iberians took the first step into Roman imperialism and were more deserving of protection as a result. If the Iberians had initially obeyed Rome, their daughters would not have been sexually assaulted as captives deserved. The threat of wartime sexual violence had to be explained to Scipio here in this passage. Like I said, it is improbable that Scipio, a seasoned military leader, was unaware of the dangers faced by women and children during times of conflict. And this passage likely masks the Roman complicity or feigns ignorance regarding the threats posed to these vulnerable individuals. Polybius in this passage creates a feeling of good cheer and kindness at the hands of Romans, which was clearly for a Roman audience to accept Scipio and the Roman military as exercising the honorable virtue of clemency. In reality, the Iberian female captives were met with the opposite fate, especially when there was a Roman cultural standard in place of how captive women and children were expected to be treated. Moreover, it shows the complexity of the difference between what it means to be a hostage or a captive. The Iberian women were used to barter for peace and to force the submission of Iberian tribes. In doing so, the women and daughters effectively were transformed from captives who deserved to be raped to noble hostages not to be touched. Non-Roman children are also seen as bargaining chips to maintain peace. During the Republican and Imperial periods, there was a transition into the practice of elite children being voluntarily offered to Rome by their parents, and a tradition that has been upheld since the Hellenistic era. Now, generals demanded children to be used as tokens to broker and maintain peace. In certain cases, such as the situation involving Sertorius and the Iberian tribes, the condition of being a child hostage could prove precarious, contingent upon their parents maintaining the peace accord and the discretion of the commanding Roman general amidst a conflict. So in the year 77 BC, Sertorius, who was a Roman general and governor of Iberia at the time, took Iberia's children hostage during an uprising. This action was part of his strategy to secure the loyalty of the local people and maintain control over the region during his rebellion against the Roman Republic. So Plutarch talks about the children of Iberia's noble class being taken hostage under the guise of formal Roman education, with the hope of one day serving Rome, and Sertorius dressing them in Roman garb, which is, in this instance, the toga praetexta. So this toga was normally reserved for Roman senators' free-born children, male and female. The seemingly illustrious position that Sertorius placed the Iberian children in was quickly taken away from them. When their parents betrayed and rebelled against him, he took these boys that he put into school to teach them Latin and Roman mores. He took them out of the school, killed some, and sold the rest into slavery. And this use of schools in imperial conquest and other conquered territories like Gaul and Britain is what Ann Kuttner has defined as a devious imperialist tool of subjugation. Similarly, during the Illyrian Wars of 33 BC, Augustus was reported to have demanded that 700 children be taken from their Dalmatian families as hostages to end the conflict. Augustus formally incorporates the taking of male child hostages into imperial artistic language, as we can see here on the Bosco Reale cups. that depicts Gallic chieftains giving up their toddler-aged sons to a seated Augustus. So wartime sexual violence can also act as an impetus for conflict. Tacitus provides an account of rape committed by Roman soldiers against Batavian boys during a military conscription ordered by Vitellius in the 1st century AD. Tacitus reports this, among other grievances held by Civilis, as a reason to revolt against Roman occupation. The Batavian men unable to serve in the military were removed from the group. The old were separated from the young to be sold, and the young, and what is identified as beautiful boys, were taken by the Roman soldiers and raped. Whether Tacitus saw this as unlawful and corrupt is no concern here. For our purposes, this passage provides evidence of Roman soldiers' rape of young boys and the supposed selection criteria, young and beautiful, for those singled out to be assaulted. This criteria is also what attracts elite men to purchase and sexually abuse boys. A graffito at Pompeii reads, quote, "If a boy has the fortune to be born beautiful, but does not offer his ass, let him be in love with a beautiful girl, but not get to fuck her." In the example of the Batavian boys, rape can be a part of examining male bodies during conscription, a way to take stock of what the Romans deemed property. Tacitus does not tell us what happened to the young Batavian boys after they were assaulted. The market price for quote-unquote beautiful young boys was high, according to Polybius, and Vitellius or another Roman commander could have capitalized on selling these boys. Unfortunately, all of this now has to remain conjecture. Another thing that could happen to young boys on the battlefield is castration, and this was employed for specific reasons and can be done on the battlefield or at the hands of the slave dealer. It could attempt to delay the onset of puberty for the boys before taking them to the auction block. The buyers, that be it male or female, preferred them to look young. For the female purchaser, castration acted or could act as a natural contraception. Captive children can also be exploited by Roman soldiers post-capture. We also have a poem from Juvenal who talks about an Armenian boy, more effeminate than all the rest, who gave himself to a passionate tribune, so another military official. And he talks about, look what foreign trade yields. He came here as a hostage. We make them men of the world. If such boys stay longer, adopting Roman ways, they'll never lack lovers. Docking their breeches and little knives, their bridles and whips. Those are the teenage ways they'll take home to Armenia. So again, we have this idea of an ideal captive here, an effeminate young boy. We also have ancient ages that come from different poetry in the 1st century AD. And these are specifically in reference to Delicae, who were children, enslaved children, and favorite, what we call toys of the elite, to be treated sexually in whatever way the owner desired. While this term Delicae does not always refer to young boys or girls being bought or sold for sex specifically, and solely, they can also refer to young boys and girls purchased and entertain their masters and guests at dinner parties and also bathhouses in non-sexual ways. However, as we will see in a second, that the correlation between where some of these images, like this bronze sculpture of an Ethiopian enslaved boy holding a lamp, the context, whether it be banqueting, bathing, all lead back to sexual exploitation. So here we have ages mentioned only boys and older boys carrying wine by Philo. So a freeborn boy or puer, age fixed in Roman law 7 to 14. So in Roman law, that is the legal age of a freeborn boy. Age range of an enslaved boy is not chronologically limited to prepubertal boys, which is under the age of 12 in this context. And older boys here means just pubertal or post-pubertal. So the ages of these boys are very ambiguous. In the 1st century, poet Martial sheds light on the motivation for the poet's lover's admiration for young boys. The boys are described as difficult, they resist, thwart the poet, argue, and run away. They're expensive. The gifts they demand are not as lavish as those by his mistress, and the boys are often imagined on the auction block and far too costly for the poet to buy. This also provides some insights into desirable or idealistic ages. And again, we have another passage from Stratton of Sardis, and he talks about how 12, 13, 14 is better than 15, 16, or 17. There are specific tastes that are mentioned in poetry. So Antony is said to like boys from the Alps. Statius Meler is from Egypt. Augustus is said to have liked boys from Syria and Moors. But then we come to the places of exploitation. So Theodorus Priscianus was a doctor who urged impotent men to obtain, quote, the services of pretty boys and girls. Horace recommends a slave girl or slave boy, quote unquote, for, quote, when your crotch is about to burst. At dinner, Seneca's epistles, he says, quote, I shall not mention the troops of luckless boys who must put up with other shameful treatment after the banquet is over. Quick-tongued pretty boys from the East, not reserved exclusively for the master's entertainment, but also for the dinner, the cena, where quips and jokes were always welcome. He says this brings the master personal amusement and social prestige. And, quote, adults promote his exposure, teaching him provocative attitudes that present him to everyone as ready and willing to be approached. Baths are another place where boys have been mentioned to be an area for vulnerability and exploitation. Again, Juvenal in his satires too. He mentions handsome boys. So again, we have appearance being a criteria here, a key criteria. In the good old days were modest and indecent instead of handing down the baths of offering themselves for money. And this depiction of an Ethiopian boy was found in a bath, the statue here. And Ethiopian boy bath attendants had value as an exotic slave, and they were a clear indicator of wealth and status upon the master. But they could also function as an instrument of protection, like an apotropeia, against the evil eye. And the Colosseum is also said to have been a place where a lot of cruising for young children was going on, enslaved children. So there's ample evidence for the market of enslaved children. Enslaved boys are equated with merchandise, as we've seen. There were special markets for them in Rome and Capua, according to Pliny and Varro. And there were even well-known slave dealers who prepared them to look sexually appealing on the auction block. What is unclear from this type of evidence is if these children were prisoners of war. The context in which they were captured is not provided. However, it is highly probable that male children captured during wartime and selected to be sold on the slave market in Italy would have likely passed through one of these markets. So in addition to the characteristics mentioned, such as youth, effeminacy, and beauty, these characteristics constrain enslaved children to an ideal commodity, and this omits those who do not conform to this perfect ideal. And here we have Polybius going back to the scene with Scipio and the Iberian women and daughters. And later in the passage, his soldiers come across a girl of surpassing bloom and beauty, and being aware that Scipio was fond of women, brought her to him and introduced her, saying that they wished to make a present of the damsel to him. He was overcome and astonished by her beauty, but he told them that had he been in private position, no present would have been more welcome to him, but since he was a general, he could not accept such an offer. How kind of him. This is more of an expression, again, of Roman military discipline and clemency. And so Scipio here cannot be tempted by such a young and beautiful captive. Again, underscoring this idea of what is an ideal captive, the types of attributes that Roman literary poets, historiographers, and artists are looking to portray. So this focus of youth and beauty may have served as a selection criterion for captive children, yet it does prompt an inquiry into the fate of those who did not align with this idealized standard. So that brings in an idea that I would like to developed further in another paper is this idea of a queer reading of this historical narrative, which would offer a crucial lens, revealing a marginalized identities and perspectives often neglected in traditional accounts. So contrary to the prevailing notion that the primary aim was the exploitation of beautiful children, a queer reading unveils how the ideal victim symbolizes the intricate cultural anxieties of Roman society regarding gender, sexuality, and age. Often overshadowed in traditional narratives, I argue that children who deviate from the conventional standards of beauty merit attention. A queer analysis will prompt this exploration into how these marginalized individuals were still subjected to exploitation, violence, and trauma within Roman culture. It underscores the significance of acknowledging and amplifying the voices and experiences of all enslaved children, regardless of their conformity to social standards of attractiveness or desirability. And this has been perpetuated down into more modern art, so I would say recent art. And we have Captives in Rome by Charles William Bartlett, who portrays these young boys as the ideal victim, as the ideal captive that the Romans have been doing in the past. They're unclothed, they're effeminate, they're beautiful, and you have a Roman soldier approaching them trying to get their attention. So for the Romans, and non-Roman captive children were a real prize of war and commodity as a result of Roman imperialism and conquest. From the moment of capture, they experienced and were under threat of sexual violence. Conquest iconography provides visual evidence of the trafficking of captive children through the scenes of capture and transport. There was also an inextricable link between the conquered non-Roman and the Roman ability to penetrate the enemy physically and visually. Non-Roman children in conquest iconography, however subtle, reflect this discourse. These children were first trafficked and experienced sexual assault and exploitation during this time before they were sold as commodities, something we must all accept. When the literary and pictorial evidence is combined, they allow us to peer ever so slightly into the traffic in children during the Roman period, a reality these children were forced to endure. And after all of that dark stuff, I want to say thank you and put up pictures of my dogs so it's not so bleak. Thank